Hello, and welcome to Distant Echoes, New Mexico 27, Comanches 2, Empire. Last episode, we began to lay out the growth of the Comanche Empire from their migration into the edge of the Spanish frontier in the early 1700s to their growth to a major player on the colonial stage and nearly causing the collapse of both Texas and New Mexico. We left off during a time of relative peace under Governor Cachupin. Peace in New Mexico would again crumble, however, in 1767 when Cachupin would leave office. Again, the Spanish failed to grasp what was needed for successful diplomacy with the Comanche, namely personal ties. The Spanish were more focused on maintaining their link to their southern territories and let the personal ties required to keep the peace slip. The Spanish also placed troops on the frontier, which further escalated tensions. After a short bout of violence, peace would be renegotiated until a drought hit, which would restart the whole thing all over again. This time, the raids would devastate the herds of New Mexico, severely weakening its economy. This is the period when raiding would peak in New Mexico, roughly in the 1770s. And in the 1770s and 1780s, the Comanches would reach a number of 2 horses per capita in their horse herds. This is roughly twice what they needed for survival. Overall, New Mexico would become an easier slaving frontier than other directions the Comanches had access to. The Spanish would pursue a policy of centralizing Spanish settlers into more defensible settlements in New Mexico. However, they would meet stiff resistance from New Mexicans. The Comanches would still attend the trade fairs in New Mexico, sometimes raiding shortly before, after, or during the fairs. This raiding and trading is a theme among the Comanches, where the Comanches probably better reflected the true autonomous nature of Spanish towns on the frontier compared to how the Spanish like to portray it as part of their empire. The raiding would increase or decrease in opposition to the availability of trader gifts, and the Comanches saw Taos as separate from the rest of New Mexico, as the town had maintained the personal ties required for peaceful relations outside of the Spanish government's own attempts to maintain those kinds of relations. Due to this seeming disloyalty from Taos, there were concerns over Taos's loyalty to the Spanish crown, a fear that would spread to many New Mexican settlements in the coming decades. The Spanish couldn't cancel the trade with the Comanches, though, even if they had wanted to, because it would cause what little economy existed in New Mexico to collapse. The trade fairs offered almost every good that the Spanish desired but could not get through the imperial supply lines. It also was really the only source of Native American slaves for the colony, which wealthy households relied on to function. And without this trade, their households would collapse. By the mid-1770s, the Utes had been pushed back to Utah Lake. And in 1776, hostilities between the Apaches and the Comanches would begin once again. The Comanches raided Texas for goods and livestock that they could sell in Louisiana. During the 1760s, relations with the Tonkawas would collapse. Around that same time, relations with the Hassanais would also deteriorate. The Teiovaya alliance would continue to bear fruit, though. The Teiovayas were beginning to come into their own light and were beginning to eclipse the Apaches in certain areas, such as trade. And they would, at some points, limit trade of choice goods like guns to the Comanches, which would strain relations. And this, by 1770, the Wichita, including the Teiovayas, had pledged allegiance to Spain. The Teiovayas even went against the Comanches in a Spanish attempt to get the Comanches to stop raiding Texas. They were also incentivized to keep the two groups at odds rather than to foster peace between the Spanish and the Comanches. They would even stifle certain peace delegations to keep the two groups at hostility so that they could better play both of them off of each other and reap the rewards of playing both sides. Due to this, Comanches began to distance themselves from the Wichita and began a trade war to grind them down. By 1778, they were raiding deep into Wichita territory. The Wichita were also being pressured on all sides by other rivals. Disease would strike in 1777 and 1778 as they concentrated into larger settlements. This epidemic allowed the Comanches to basically vassalize the Wichita and step right into that trade niche that they had before. This would also allow the Spanish and the Comanches to talk peace once again, with great help from the Spanish governor of Louisiana. The peace attempt would fail, though, due to 3 things. The Spanish king would reject peace with the Comanches, the Spanish governor of Louisiana would die, and the Revolutionary War would cause the Spanish to want to cut costs in Texas. All 3 of these items would sink the peace efforts, which were often based on gift-giving to the Comanches. This and an earlier attack on Comanches by Spanish settlers caused the Comanches to start a raiding war in Texas. They also attacked the tribes of Texas surrounding them to keep them weak and allow them to be the major power in the area. The raiding war in Texas during this time was a near blow-to-blow repeat of what we saw in New Mexico. This time raiding would peak in 1781. Again, it would end in annual gift-giving from Texas to the Comanches. As a result of Comanche influence in the southern plains, the Spanish were unable to push their influence like they dreamed. The Comanches basically served as a major check on their power north of the Mexican core, and they even ate away at their influence at the frontier of the Spanish Empire. Overall, the Spanish had failed to accurately assess the threats in North America after the 7 Years' War. They instead focused on other colonial powers and ignored the growing power of native nations along their northern frontier, which served as a major way to check their power and keep them from achieving their ambitions. In the early years of the 1780s, a smallpox epidemic would hit the Comanches, and they wouldn't be raiding as much, and that actually would cause greater anxiety among the Spanish than when the raids were actually happening. At the northern frontier, the Spanish Empire was caving in. Native tribes that had been exiled by their lands from the Comanches were trying to carve a new home in Spanish territory, often violently, and rather than a base for Spanish expansion, Texas and New Mexico were turned into bases for the imperial expansion of the Comanches, a way for them to extract wealth from the Spanish Empire. The Comanches had turned the plains from a backwater into a commercial and diplomatic hub, giving the empire staying power. They turned Spanish colonies into their own imperial holdings in all but name. Despite the surface of Comanche society seeming decentralized, there were centralizing elements that allowed for greater coordination of foreign policy as well. A good example is Cuerno Verde, who would rise as a figure of some political authority among the Comanches. He was, in reality, probably a war chief or civil leader who rose to lead the raiding economy in New Mexico. His personal qualities probably allowed him to form a network of true friends and formal friends, those close personal ties so important to the Comanches, some of whom were likely leaders in their own right, and all of this would give him a significant amount of political authority at grand councils. His own rise may have fostered greater centralization as well. It's not the elder Cuerno Verde we're interested in, but really his son, also called Cuerno Verde. When the Cuerno Verde, the elder, died, it's possible that he passed on some of his political power to his son, implying that there was some form of centralization among the political areas of Comanche society. In the mid-1780s, the Spanish would tour Comanche lands and found 12 local groupings. Each of these groups was led by a captain who likely competed with other captains for followers. Per the Spanish, these captains were subordinate to 2 head chiefs, and these head chiefs were elected formally. Overall, the Comanche system was designed to be both diffuse and centralized at the same time. And that gave it the flexibility it needed to adapt to the various environments they encountered in their holdings. By the mid-1700s, there were really distinctly 2 groups of Comanches. The Eastern Comanches, who raided Texas and traded to the Mississippi Valley, and the Western Comanches, who raided and traded in New Mexico. But the 2 groups cooperated closely, and these differences do not appear to have led to a political rift between the 2 groups. However, their political ambitions would begin to diverge as the Comanches expanded their territory. But the specialization of each group also pulled them together in an active trade across their resource domains. The Western Comanches had access to European goods via the Mandan and Hidatsa villages, and the Eastern Comanches had access to horses and mules, which were abundant on the plains. Thus, the 2 were able to complement each other's needs. The trade fairs on the plains also let them forge personal ties. These ties allowed them to forge the Comanche Confederacy and push back against a new Spain that was ready to react. In 1786, New Mexico's governor Juan Bautista de Anza met with Uquicapa, captain general of the Western Comanches, to talk peace. It could be argued that this peace was what saved New Mexico from complete collapse. Something similar would happen in Texas. But what caused a sudden shift in policy from the Comanches, a shift from war to peace? The Spanish explained it as Carlos III's reforms in the 1760s and 1770s, which we will talk about in future episodes, mainly the creation of the Commandant General and the internal provinces, which was a top-level administration attention paid to the northern territories. Funds, livestock, and high-caliber administrators were sent north, especially to New Mexico. The goal was to more fully integrate the far north into the Spanish Empire. As we'll talk about later, the plan was also to make it more defendable by building presidios from the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of California, roughly along the 30th parallel, and to reinforce Santa Fe and San Antonio. Governor Anza, arguably one of Spain's most able servants, was able to bring war to the Comanches on their own turf in 1779, killing Cuerno Verde. This would be the biggest military expedition Spain would send to the plains. Overall, he had almost 800 men. He would kill Cuerno Verde. To the Spanish, it felt like Anza had brought the Comanches to heel. But it may have just been good timing as the Comanche borders had flared up again. The Kiowas and Pawnees were hostile, the Osages and the Apaches were still hostile, and expansion into Ute territory had somehow turned into a retreat, although the details there are unclear. They also ran into economic reversals, with the Osages managing to diminish old Comanche trading partners. The Spanish would seize the eastern banks of the Mississippi during the Revolutionary War, denying British smugglers access to the area. Franco-Spanish traders also began to move elsewhere to reap profits. This made the earlier displacement of the Wichitas worthless. The 1780 and 1781 smallpox epidemic also devastated the nomadic populations of the Comanches. It is estimated that the eastern Comanches lost as much as 2/3 of the population. The western Comanches were spared much of this pain thanks to Anza's victory, as it pushed them into a more defensive stance before the smallpox outbreak and the reversals with the borders. It was in this environment that the Comanches reconsidered their position towards the Spanish. In 1781 and 1782, they began to cut back on raiding in Texas. In 1783, they opened peace talks in Santa Fe. The end of the Revolutionary War would return Florida to Spain and start new border conflicts between the Spanish Empire and the newly independent US of A. But the Spanish felt more threatened at this point than in a position to dominate the Americans. They closed trade to the lower Mississippi to try and isolate Kentucky and Tennessee, areas they had designs on. But they did open Louisiana and Florida to immigrants that would be, as long as those immigrants became Catholic and Spanish vassals. The Spanish overall were trying to turn the borders of their empire into a defensible buffer zone filled with immigrants that were loyal to the crown or loyal tribes. Instead of conversion and coercion, though, now gifts and treaties were the order of the day when dealing with native nations. The Spanish tried to make peace with the eastern Comanches from Texas in 1785. Key point of this treaty was non-interference in Comanche-Apache affairs, but peace in Texas was achieved. The western Comanches overall had kind of split into two factions as far as the question of peace. One group favored war and the other favoring peace. In 1775, some hostages were returned to New Mexico, and some Comanche stayed behind as hostages to keep the avenues for peace open between the two groups. The Texas peace, though, would bring a boost to the western peace faction. Icretcapa was chosen as the one to treat directly with Governor Anza. He may have been one of the primary chiefs in the eastern peace, but the exact reasons he was chosen to fulfill this role were unclear. In December 1785, the Comanches sent captured Spaniards and 2 envoys to inform Governor Anza that Icretcapa was coming. In January 1786, Pecos was attacked in its last raid. The Utes did not like the word of this peace, and they would send their own delegation to voice their complaints to the Spanish governor. This delegation would actually be invited by Governor Anza to the Comanche peace talks. Icretcapa came with an agenda, lack of goods being the foremost issue he was trying to remedy. He demanded a right to settle a short distance from Spanish settlements, a Pecos trade fair, free passage to Santa Fe, and a joint war between the Spanish and the Comanches against the Apaches. This would give the Comanches a virtual monopoly over New Mexico's eastern markets. Basically, they wanted trade and for New Mexico to make a commitment to the Comanches over their rival powers in the area. Icretcapa wanted a token of his esteem with the New Mexicans and for Anza to deliver the details with him at Pecos. This last demand was part logistics, with Pecos being an easier base for the Comanches, and part for political gain, as showing that he had the ability to make these deals with the Spanish. The conference also allowed for the Utes and the Comanches to make peace. The Comanches would shift south and let the Utes have the north of New Mexico. Governor Anza had tried to turn Icretcapa into a Spanish vassal and basically use him as a way to completely subjugate the Comanches, but overall Icretcapa was non-committal. They then went to Pecos to reveal the results to the Comanches. Governor Anza accepted the demands one by one and presented Icretcapa with a cane of office. This cane would be transferred to Icretcapa's direct junior, Tosancandata. This perhaps is a political move in of itself to show that it was really the Comanches who were in control of who was to be their agent that dealt with the Spanish and not the other way around. With peace secured, they held a trade fair. Anza had managed to secure the grounds for a lasting peace via economic ties with the Comanches. It also gave the Spanish greater leverage over some of the other nomadic tribes in the areas, such as the Navajo. And with the Apaches as the common enemy of this new alliance, they were able to finally fulfill the suggestion made 20 years earlier by the Marquis de Ruby, that the Apaches were to be given 3 choices: submission willingly, submission by force, or complete extermination. The only Apache group able to maneuver their way into this new alliance was the Jicarillas. Frequent visits to Santa Fe reflect a Comanche principle that ties between societies are best cemented through intimate, face-to-face interactions. Again, those personal ties were the important part to helping keep a lasting peace. The Comanches would approach the Spanish in the summer of 1787 and ask them to build a settlement on the upper Arkansas for them to live in, something Governor Anza saw as a way to begin the process of making farmers out of the nomadic peoples. In the end, however, the village would be abandoned after the favored wife of the leader living there died. The plains were also open to New Mexican hunters as a result of this peace, giving them access. The Spanish planned to use the gifts, trade, and military collaboration to make vassals of the Comanches. Their main goal was to make them economically dependent on the Spanish Empire. The office of head chieftainship would become a permanent office to allow for communication between the two groups. However, this also acted as a way for the Comanches to subvert Spanish designs. The head chieftainship to the Comanches was more of an officer for getting economic and political favors from the Spanish rather than a true central leader that the Spanish envisioned. This allowed them to subvert Spanish designs of appointing one leader of the Comanches that they could control. Spanish endorsement would never become necessary for this office either. Instead, the Spanish normally found out who the new person in that office was after they had been chosen for that role. Texas overall had a harder time making and keeping peace, as they had a larger number of smaller groups to treat with, and that led to an overall more delicate situation. The Spanish did learn the extent of their alliance, though, such as the Comanches not being willing to return Spanish captives for free. In 1792, due to raids stemming from a drought, the Utes and the Navajo were at war with the Comanches again. Overall, this new peace can be summed up thusly from the Comanche Empire. Quote, "Behind such lamentations lay a deeper truth that would become increasingly clear during the early 19th century. Comanches, not Spaniards, would dictate the limits of the alliance and determine its character. Comanches would continue to formulate their relationship with Spanish colonists through their own interests and on their own terms, and the Southwest would remain an open field of power where relations among nations were determined on the ground, not in distant colonial centers. And out of this configuration would emerge an imperial order the Spaniards could not have imagined, the Comanche Empire." End quote. Before we wrap up this episode, though, I want to talk about these gifts the Spanish gave the Comanches. In traditional narratives surrounding the Spanish interactions, these gifts to native nations on their fringes are portrayed as an incentive to bring them into the Spanish fold, where the Spanish will then somehow make them subjects of the Spanish crown and integrate them into the greater empire. Basically, a way to seek economic dependence of the nomadic tribes. However, as we talked about, the amount of gifts giving was directly correlated to the amount of raiding activity in New Mexico and Texas. Really, it was more of a protection racket type relationship than anything else. You could imagine the Comanches coming into New Mexico with a nice colony you have here. Shame if something happened to it, rather than the Spanish benevolently giving gifts to their nomadic neighbors with the intention of somehow using that to subjugate them. And really, when you look at it through this lens, when a nation extorts another nation or group for payment, it's tribute. Overall, New Mexico and Texas had both been turned into tributary states by a group of people that had better leveraged the greater geopolitical situation of the Southern Plains to their advantage. There would even be times in the future where New Mexico would choose to ignore orders to fight the Comanches, basically choosing the Comanches over the Spanish Empire. If you enjoyed the show, please share it with your friends. Leave a review on your podcast app of choice if it lets you. Since I'm a Luddite and don't use social media, word of mouth and reviews are the only way the show spreads. We have a website located at engineeringfire.org. That's spelled ENGINEERINGFIRE.org, where I have a link in the header for podcast resources, including pictures, companion posts, my bibliography, and the transcripts of each show. We have an email you can submit comments and questions to at michael@engineeringfire.org. The intro music is Desperados by Frank Schroeder and sourced from filmmusic.io. The outro music is NeoWestern from Kevin McLeod of Incompetech. Links to all things mentioned are present in the show notes and at the website. Thank you all so much for listening, and I will see you in the next episode.